Welcome back to the Mind Change Podcast. I'm your host, Heather McKean. And today we'll be covering the emotional drivers behind constipation. So we've all probably experienced at some point in our lives difficulty having a bowel movement. So most of us are familiar with how uncomfortable constipation can be. Ideally, we would be going 1 to 3 times a day, quickly and easily. But for some people, that seems nearly impossible. And that means their condition has become chronic. Now, chronic constipation is constipation that lasts longer than 3 months or longer, and it can lead to other serious complications if not addressed. Now, from a mind change perspective, constipation is simply a message from the mind being carried by the body. And if we don't know how to listen, so if we don't listen or we don't know how to listen, then the message can get more frequent and a lot louder. So chronic constipation in and of itself is hard and difficult and painful, but it can also lead to things like hemorrhoids and anal fissures or tears in the anal tissue, impacted colon, or even a rectal prolapse, which can involve your rectum being pushed outside of your body. So not fun stuff. And it's kind of amazing that people are now out there making millions of dollars talking specifically about poo. And yeah, you study it and the shapes of it and the colors of it and everything like that. And yet it's amazing how many people are still dealing with whether it's even low-level constipation or very chronic, high-level constipation. In fact, a study from the National Institute of Health even showed that people who suffer from chronic constipation have a 12% higher risk of all-cause mortality and also a 19% higher risk of developing coronary heart disease and stroke. So something that seems like it may be a small kind of common thing, left undealt with over time, can become something much, much bigger. So some of the main emotional drivers behind constipation are you are holding on to old patterns, programs, and experiences that are not serving you. In most situations, you hold on to the negative, but possibly have a difficult time seeing any positive. You are refusing to work on something that is holding you back. You might be in denial, or you might just be refusing to see the areas where you can grow. It may also be that you are desperate to get out of something. That could be a situation, a relationship, a career, or maybe even a position in life. But you're holding on to utilize your skills at the time. You're holding on to past failures or negative experiences. And that will block your flow or your ability to see out of any of these situations in a positive way. Someone who does constipation may act in a possessive, controlling, or stubborn way to get what they want out of people. It's very common for people who do constipation to have a lack mentality in areas like life, love, finances, or even opportunities. And that makes sense if one of the primary drivers is holding on to the negative and not seeing the positive, because that then formulates and helps set our reticular activating system, which if you don't know the reticular activating system, check out. We've got an entire chapter about it in the book, the Mind Change book, and we talk a lot about it on the podcast, but also in some of our social media. And so if the reticular activating system is set on all of what you can't have or all of what you've tried before and had negative consequences, what that does is it really projects into your present and into your future that pretty much everything you do is going to turn out the same way. And so that's going to show up in all of these different areas in life, love, finances, and in future opportunities, careers. So because you're holding on to the emotions and all of those things from the past that need to be released and processed through. So another driver is you may tend to be a person who has a hard time asking for help and support. And at the same time, you also feel that people are never there for you and that you're always on your own. So again, this is one of those things that we are actually, because of the beliefs, because of our previous experiences, we are projecting out and creating behaviors that keep people from even sometimes seeing our need or offering help or offering support, which then in turn confirms. So remember, what we're doing here with the reticular activating system is looking for confirmation bias. So if we're someone who won't ask for help, won't express the need for support, tries to keep people at an arm's length, then that confirms that, oh, see, nobody's ever there for me and I'm all on my own and I have to do all of these things on my own. And so it becomes a vicious cycle. So there also might be some tracking back to this through your ancestry. So in your ancestry, there may have been times of great lack or poverty or famine or need and hardship. And because that wasn't resolved in the ancestry, then it's being passed down epigenetically, which means some of this hardship that you feel may not even have been yours to carry. And that metaphorically is being represented in our body because you're holding on to all the crap that you shouldn't be holding on to. So another thing is this idea of holding on to past hurts, but rarely trying to resolve them. So preferring to remember the hurt and the letdown as a way to keep you safe from being hurt again. That's a very common coping mechanism. And it just, again, keeps us stuck, trapped. And so we frequently feel that in our life. We feel stuck, trapped, stifled, used, unproductive. But rather than doing anything about it, we're resistant to change. So we do nothing at all. Think about how metaphoric that is for constipation, for the going to get a little graphic here, folks. But when you've impacted these things, the poop, if you will, and you haven't let it go and it's backed up and backed up, it does become harder. It becomes stuck. It becomes compacted. So then when it is time to let this go, it becomes painful. And one of the things around chronic constipation is when there is that listen, it's got to get out eventually. And it starts to come out, but we've backed it up and it's so difficult and it's so painful that when it does start to come out, it stretches so wide that then we get the anal fissures. And that is highly painful. So then even change or even the letting go process becomes painful. And then the belief system around that is that it hurts more to change. It hurts more to let go than it does to just keep it in. Another way to see that this might be happening is frequent talk about the good old days. And yet, if you were to dig deeper with yourself or this person, it's hard to find good times. There is often a resistance to digest situations or go deeper and take responsibility. So this manifests in a way that if someone does become aware that maybe there's a pattern or maybe there's an issue in a relationship or there's a conflict, this person, someone doing constipation, will prefer to just try to avoid or ignore or blame shift or chalk it up to, well, this is the kind of stuff that always happens to me. And what's happening is they're resisting digesting this information, taking the good and releasing the negative. And if we're going to talk about an overall view of constipation, that's what's happening. So metaphorically in the body, we ingest and we take in all sorts of food and water and things that are meant to nourish our body. Especially in this day and age, we are putting a lot of things in our body that aren't nourishing. And even beyond that, there's natural toxins and everything that are in the air, things that if not broken down properly in the food that we eat can actually sometimes do harm to our body. So the digestive system is created to take care of all of that. If in our mind, we are someone who takes the negative and holds on to the negative, but resists taking any of the good or seeing any of the good or connecting with any of the good, the nurturing things, our body will metaphorically represent this for us. It's trying to communicate to us that it needs the good, it needs the nurturing, it needs all of those nutrients from what is supposed to be feeding us. And yet, we tend to be holding on to the toxic parts of life, relationships, and experiences. And this may come because in childhood, you may have had difficulty with authority, and yet you find yourself in relationships or jobs or even maybe spiritual communities or churches that help you feel less than and oppressed, which again keeps you in this cycle. So there may be this consistent push-pull between wanting things to be different in your life and yet very fearful that they may just get worse if you change. There's often a strong correlation between constipation and financial or money problems. And this makes a lot of sense because money and finances are around abundance, around nurturing, around having. And if in your life you are focused more on the negative or focused on more the hardships that have happened to you in your life, it's incongruent for there to be a lot of financial abundance and yet have so much lack and hardship. So your energy is choosing one. And so oftentimes, because it stays more in alignment with what you know and with what you're saying in your mind and with the experiences in your mind that you're holding on to, you keep the lack. So in essence, we are pushing away abundance financially and also in a lot of other areas of our life. And so childhood environments that are common drivers for someone who later in life does chronic constipation are growing up in a home that was controlling, yet felt very insecure. So this would be if there was a lot of domination, a lot of authoritarian control, and yet the person maybe that was the controller or the one that was keeping dominion was very insecure in their own moods or lives. So maybe they would be happy, jollying, 1 minute, and then in a flip of a switch, they could be angry and even abusive. And so it's such a paradox in our mind because things are kept so controlling, and yet the person doing the controlling is so insecure. And so as a child, that really wires in some confusing messages. As a child, you had a deep need for more love, for more nurturing, and those needs went for various reasons unmet. Now, you may have had a mother who, for many reasons, was not able to give you the love and nurturing that you needed. This can be from a lot of different reasons why. And again, never to make excuses for why the nurturing wasn't happening, because the nurturing needed to be there. That's a truth. But it is also a truth sometimes that the nurturing that is needed by these children, a parent or a primary caregiver in and of themselves is unable to provide. And so this could happen if there was a mother who was, let's say, sick or disabled or had a chronic health condition. It also could be if there was the situation with a domineering or controlling or even possibly abusive father, and the mother was in a constant state of trying to mitigate the father. And if most of the mother's energy was going to mitigate the father, to buffer this, then the energy that was needing to go to nurturing and loving and being there for the children was actually going to mitigate the damage of the father. And it's from the mother's perspective, she is trying to protect the child. She is trying to give to the child in that way. And that's the mother doing the best she can at the time. But what that does for the child is they are still starved for nurturing. They're still starved for the energy that the mother was giving this situation. And so that's what ends up happening there. And there's various other reasons why maybe the mother was possibly not able to give the nurturing that was needed. And it's not all the mother's fault. Remember, we don't do fault here at Mind Change. We're looking for the situations and the perspectives that may help us understand a little bit deeper what it is that our body was missing and needed and is trying to communicate to us. So another thing is you may have learned from your primary caregivers or through a coping mechanism of your own that your emotions were not safe, and so you would stuff them down because you perceived your unmet needs would not be heard. You feared that you would become rejected or even abandoned if you became too much of a burden. You may have often felt that caregivers or authorities in your life did not listen to you, and you may have developed difficulties in stating your own needs and your own desires because you felt like they weren't going to be heard anyway. Now, because you felt so controlled or watched or judged in your early childhood, you began to look for ways to be in control. So you may have had issues with food as a child. You may have held your bowel movements as a child, and that would have been a way to assert your power. Now, that was all done subconsciously. Children do not have ability to think through these things consciously. And so their bodies are very clear sounding boards, if you will, for what's happening. So a child needs agency and sovereignty, even in the midst of being protected or watched over by authorities or caregivers. And without that feeling of autonomy being built over time, children will figure out ways to do it. Food is one of the primary ways that happens, but then also holding bowel movements is another very common way of a child trying to assert some sort of power, sovereignty over their own life. Again, in a childhood environment, you may have grown up with lack or a poverty mindset from parents. A parent may have talked about money or like physical provisions in a way that made you feel bad or made you feel guilty or even made you feel afraid. If a parent was sort of that paycheck to paycheck mentality and as a way communicating to themselves or as a way to kind of keep that situation as controlled as possible, they threatened, we may not have money for groceries. We may not be able to keep the lights on. We may lose our house. Someone might just come and take our car away. They, in doing that, communicating their own poverty and lack mindset. For a child, they don't understand that those are not always actualities that could happen. And for some people, those were actualities that could happen. But children don't need to be the ones carrying the burden of that fear. If they do, it really triggers some survival mechanisms within the mind and body. And also around that guilt piece, you may have been made to feel guilty for wanting or asking for more. If there's a poverty and lack mindset in the home, you begin to see your needs or even wants and desires as burdens. And oftentimes you won't even express them. You won't even speak them because you don't want to put more burden on the family. You don't want to feel guilty, even more guilty than you may already feel. And you definitely don't want those needs rejected or abandoned because you already feel that way. There's so much lack already. Another driver for chronic constipation, you may have felt like you had to compete in your home with a sibling or even with the other parent for another parent's attention. To get what you needed, you may have overgiven to others beyond your own boundaries or abilities. And then when your needs still remained unmet, over time, you may have developed a stubbornness or that pessimistic attitude that we were talking about as a way to explain why you never got what you needed. So what a child believes when they don't get their needs met is that something is wrong with them. It's just the way that it works. Over time, as they start to mature and actualize and begin to have all of their brain chemistry working, to believe that you are not enough and that you're not worthy and that you're not valuable is such a heavy, heavy, heavy burden for the mind and body to carry. So we keep that, but we start diffusing it a little bit by making it that that's the way everybody else is. We start putting that out into the world, that negativity, that pessimism, that, well, it's people or the world, and that's why I don't get my needs met. You're still carrying a belief that it's you deep, deep down inside, but we've got to figure out ways to diffuse that once in a while so we become blame shifters and victims of what feels like the world at large and people in relationships. So to be healthy, our bodies developed a system, like I talked about earlier, to take all of the needed nutrients and vitamins from our food and dispose of what we would call the waste. And again, metaphorically, our bodies are trying to show us that we are holding on to all of this emotional waste and not properly absorbing all the good life has given us. The more we hold on to the waste, the more toxic we become physically and metaphorically. And then that vicious cycle continues. Wow. Our bodies are so amazing, aren't they? With mind change, we want to remember that these coping mechanisms are really safety mechanisms for the body. So we would never want to remove a coping mechanism that is effectively helping someone deal with what they're carrying subconsciously. But the better option is to go in and remove all the offending thoughts, memories, beliefs, and experiences, rewire that within our brains. If we do that, then our filters change. Our perception expands. The world seems less dangerous and toxic. As a reminder, the emotional drivers that I cover in this series are not designed to be attributed to infants and children. That they are often different in infants and children than they are in adults. There are similar overlapping things at times, but these are not meant to be taken and projected onto children at the time. Children are doing the best they can in their environments. And so for children, the children don't need to change as much as the environments need to change. So we're really speaking to adults and the emotional drivers behind this for adults in this series. So I look forward to seeing you as we continue with this series every other week, diving into these fascinating topics of the mind-body connection. Please make sure to keep leaving us those amazing 5-star reviews. Comment on a disease, symptom, or ailment you would like to hear us cover, and share the podcast, share the YouTube channel, share with someone else who may need to understand that their body is doing something for a very good reason and that there is a way out. So until next time, thanks for joining us on the Mind Change podcast, where we are changing the world, one mind at a time.